Okay, we've been talking about programmatic flow, and continuing with that in this video, we're going to touch on functions a little bit more in depth than we've mentioned them before. So we've already discussed functions. Functions allow you to execute some code, but they also can potentially return a value. So a function call is an expression that can be evaluated and result in a value. But it's also a set of actions, right? So when we think about programmatic flow, we're directing the flow of execution of our program. Okay, so functions are core to that. So one of the simple function I can make is do first. Okay, so this function, we'll have it say hello, and then console.log hello. All right. Now that is a function definition, right? So if this code were to run, the only thing that will have happened at this point is this function is defined. It has not been called. So here we can have another function definition, and we can say goodbye. Alright, so two simple functions. Now, neither one of these has actually executed. Okay, so a function is sort of storing a process. It's storing these instructions, and we just have one instruction in each one of these functions. But when we think about flow control, by defining these functions, then down below, whenever we want, we can execute this function, essentially moving the flow of execution from down here in our program back up to where we've defined this function. Okay, so this is flow control. So we can say, we can call this function, say hello, and we see when I run this, we're going to get our console log message. We will have defined say hello, and we will have defined say goodbye, but the only one that actually runs is say hello, because it only runs when we call the function. Okay, so let's do that real quick. So this file is called functions.js. And so we see we called say hello, and sure enough we have hello. So if I put say goodbye down here, then we're telling the program, after you execute this function, right, at this line of code, look and see if you've got a function defined, say hello. If so, execute that function. That's what the left and right parentheses say. And then, so it goes line by line and executes the function, printing out hello. Then it comes back to where the function call was made and then starts executing line by line like it normally would. The next line says, let's look for a function defined called say goodbye. If there is one, which there is, then execute that. Right? So it goes line by line and executes that. Okay, so now we see hello and goodbye. And now we have control of the flow of execution because I can reverse these. I can say goodbye first and then say hello. Goodbye, hello, which doesn't make much sense, but that's fine. I can even call it multiple times. So this is going to say goodbye 3 times and then say hello. Right? So we'll move hello back at the top. All right. So that's the basic idea of functions as flow control. That's nothing new. We've talked about functions before. But we want to start thinking about this more in depth. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, functions can be passed as arguments to other functions. Okay, so what we can do here is we can have a function to do something, and then after we do something, we might want to execute some code, right? So let's say I have let x equal 5 and let y equal 6. All right, I've got 2 variables, and I'm going to define a function to add them. And this is going to be add Okay, so these variables are out of the scope of this function, but I can still access them in JavaScript. Okay, so I don't have to define the variables within the function scope. Right, so what we'll do here is we're going to add these two variables. We get a result. So we'll say let result equal x plus y. Okay, and then I'll just console.log my result. Okay, so notice these variables were defined outside of the scope of this function. So it's an outer scope variable, not an inner scope variable. But I can still reference these variables inside. Right, so if I were to run this right now, nothing would happen because I haven't called this function. This is just a function definition. Okay, so I want to call this function. So add outer scope All right, just check spelling's good there. So now this is going to call my function, which is going to move the flow of execution up here, and we're going to define a variable that is the result of this expression. Expressions evaluate to a single value, so this is going to be 5 plus 6, so result should be 11, and then we're going to log it out. Nice and simple. So we can run this. Sure enough, functions as arguments, then it has 11. All right, so that's all well and fine. So let's take a look at adding Interscope variables. So what if I have a let x equal 9 in here? Okay, so here notice the linter highlighted this one, and it says x is assigned a value but never used. Okay, that's because once I define a variable on the inner scope of my function, the function will always refer to that variable. Since I defined one on the inner scope, anytime I reference it, it's now going to be the inner scope variable. So this is an entirely different variable. It just happens to have the same name. So this variable exists in a different scope than this variable. So now when we run this code, x is equal to 9 instead of 5. So this is going to be 9 plus 6. Right? Y is still the outer scope variable. Okay, so we can run this. And we see we get 15 instead. And I could change y as well. So the scoping of variables becomes important. Generally speaking, you don't want to have out-of-scope variables a lot. Generally speaking, you want to keep your functions contained, and you want to keep them from having side effects. Okay, so if I didn't have this let statement, I could actually set x to 9, and that would be setting this outer variable. All right, so first let's look. I've just created two inner scope variables, x and y, and then we add them together. All right, so that's 19. Now if I get rid of this let statement, now I'm referencing these out of scope, the outer scope variables. They were declared in this outer scope, and here I'm just setting them to a new value. I'm not defining a new variable on the inner scope. Right? So now this function is what we would say has a side effect. So not only does it execute some code, but there's an additional side effect in that it's modifying state outside of itself. Right? So this is state. Anything that you're storing is the state of the program. Right? So now down here, we can see that we've set this to 9 and 10, and if I run it, it would just be 19 again. But then down here, console.log, we can print out x and y, and we see they've actually changed to 9 and 10 because of what we did here. Whereas if we have the let statements, they will not change, even though the inside will still be 19, because these variables are entirely different variables from these. Okay, so that's inner and outer scope variables. All right, so to add the outer scope variables, we need to remove the let statement, or maybe we'll just keep let on one of them so you can play around with this. So we have these functions, and we can add things together, do all sorts of different things. It executes code. It's flow control, right? One of the things we can do, though, is pass in functions as arguments to other functions. Okay, so if we wanted something similar, we wanted to add these outer scope variables, we could add them and then pass in a function here. So we'll call this do after. Okay, now this is supposed to be a function. It's a different thing than a function call. So for example, if I had a simple function that was, let's see, let's put it up here, function return 2. So this function is really simple. All it does is return the number 2. Okay. I can call a function as an argument, return 2, right? But this is a function call, right? This is going to actually execute this code before this function runs, because you have to pass in a static value, right? You can't pass in an expression, right? This is an expression. It must be evaluated, right? So a function call is an expression. So this will be evaluated to 2, which is the return value of this function, and then the number 2 would be passed in as the argument here. And so this variable, or a parameter called do after, would be holding the value 2. All right, that's not what we want. What we want is an actual function to be passed in here. Okay, so something like this, we're passing in the actual function. All right, so instead of return 2, we'll call this print 2. And we don't need to return a value. We're going to say console.log and just log out the number 2. All right, so print 2 is a function that just logs the number 2. It doesn't return a value. And what we're doing is we're going to pass in print 2 to our add outer scope variables function. So this function is going to add our 2 variables together and give us a result and log that out. But then we have this do after function. Do after. And inside of our other function, we call that. Okay, so we've defined the behavior beforehand. So that's print 2. And that's what we're going to do after we add these up. Okay, so this is a very powerful idea. We can pass in functions as arguments and then inside the function call the other function. And you do this all the time in JavaScript. All right, so if we run this, we see we have added the 2 numbers together, right? We get the result of 19. Do after, printed out the number 2, and maybe we can make this a little bit more obvious. Print 2. Right, so we added the values, we get the result, we print the result, it's 19, and then we call our do after function, which says print 2. And then down here, after we've called this add outer scope variables, we log to the console the x and y. So that occurs afterwards. All right. What's interesting now is we can pass in different types of behavior. For example, I can reuse our say hello function, right? Say hello. Now this time, instead of printing 2, it's going to say hello. But it's still going to add the variables. So we have some functionality that we want to occur every time. It's just at the very end we might want to do something different. So that's the idea here, and it's a very powerful idea, specifically with JavaScript. This idea of doing something after something else isn't necessarily that powerful if you have synchronous code. So synchronous code is code executing one line at a time, right? And then instead of passing in this function do after, I could just do the thing after, like say hello, right? If my code just runs one line at a time, and then once this function runs, it can just run this function. Then why go to all the trouble of passing it in as an argument, right? So this gets into a little bit about JavaScript, and JavaScript is asynchronous. So what that means is sometimes, which we're going to have an example of this at the very end, sometimes code executes with JavaScript and it takes a certain amount of time and you don't know how long it's going to take, right? But then you want to do something afterwards. So you can't just call the function and then call the other function, because the first function you called takes a certain amount of time. Actually, as long as we're talking about it, we might as well just pull this demonstration up. Okay, so asynchronous JavaScript. This is often called a callback. Okay, so the most common function for callbacks is the set timeout function. Okay, so set timeout is a function that takes in a function as an argument, right, and then has some number of milliseconds. So we'll call this time in milliseconds. Okay, so this is the sort of function signature. Okay, so this is how you use it. You pass in a function, and then you give it a time in milliseconds. And then what happens is, essentially, JavaScript waits that amount of time, and as long as there's nothing else going on in the program, if the amount of time is expired, it's going to execute that function. So let's take a look at this. We're going to have set timeout, and then what do we want to do? We could say hello, and then we're going to wait 1 second. All right, so let's run our program. We see it pauses for a second and then hello. Let's change that. So 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. Let's do 3 seconds so it's more obvious. Right, so that waited 3 seconds to say hello. Well, what happens if we want to say hello, wait a few seconds, say hello, and then do something else after we say hello, like maybe say goodbye, right? The problem is, with set timeout, if I say goodbye right afterwards, we're going to have an issue, because set timeout waits before it executes this. But I want say goodbye to execute after say hello. So we'll put this back down to 1 second so it doesn't take so long. But when we run this, we see the set timeout function runs, which basically registers in JavaScript somewhere that in 1,000 milliseconds we need to run this function. And periodically JavaScript will, if it has no other synchronous code to run, it will check the event loop, and we'll talk about the event loop later. But the event loop basically allows JavaScript to check to see if any events have occurred, and if so, execute any code associated with them. So this particular event, set timeout, the event is checking to see if this amount of time has expired since we called this function. And if that event occurs, then it calls the function you provided it. So it calls say hello. So this is just a registration to call this later, right? But then we want to say goodbye. Now the problem is we registered to call this later, and then we have say goodbye down here. So we could try to do a set timeout of 1,000, but there's no guarantee which one will get called first, right? So we see when we called it like this, say goodbye is synchronous. It's definitely going to get called right away. This one registered, and it's supposed to get called in a second. Even though we registered this one first, it still has to wait before it executes, and then say goodbye executes right away. Right? And we saw that. We saw goodbye print out first, and then say hello. So we could try to do something like this: set timeout, say goodbye, 1,000, something like that. But there's no guarantee that this will work. It could be that goodbye prints out first, right? And so this isn't a good strategy. We want to make sure say hello prints first. So for example, we could have a for loop in here. Let I equals 0 while I is less than 10,000. I plus plus. And then we're just going to say, you know, I plus 2. And this is basically just to waste time. Okay, so this loop is frivolous. It's not doing anything functionally, but I'm trying to demonstrate this loop is going to take some time to execute. So then I can register the set timeout, say goodbye, but now I don't know how much time has elapsed. So I can't really say goodbye 1,000 because if I want this to happen immediately after say hello, I just can't be sure that's the case. Right? So I can run this. Okay, let's do more cycles so we can see the difference. So this is 1 million, maybe 10 million should get it. Hello, goodbye. Let's do a few more. This would be more obvious with the slower computer. Okay, did you see that? The hello printed, and then there was a slight delay, and then goodbye. And that's not what we wanted, right? We wanted goodbye to be immediately after. And in the first example, it looked like it was immediately after, you know, when we had this loop not running that long. So let's make this 10 times longer, and then maybe this time we'll see a longer delay. Hello, and then goodbye. That's because this takes time. So we set the timeout, we said hello and we set that to execute in 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. But then we executed a bunch of code. Now, if we want say goodbye to execute immediately after this, after running this code, we don't know how to do that exactly because we don't know how much time is left. Right? So if I just set this at 1 millisecond, or 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds, we see that there's, after this executes, JavaScript checks, or we register this one, right? And then JavaScript has nothing left to do in the program, right? The synchronous code has stopped. And what I mean by synchronous code is this program is effectively over except for the functions that are registered to execute later, right? There's no more code down here. These are just comments. All right, so since there's no more code, the JavaScript will check the event loop to see if there's anything going on. So whenever there's not synchronous code being run, it's checking the event loop. And so this concept is asynchronous JavaScript. There are things running on the event loop, and eventually they fire, right? And it's not synchronous. Like, it's not lines of code one after the other like this. So we have to have some method of attaching functionality after another function. All right, so this example shows the problem, right? So let's think of a solution. So I could take a function and I could say do one, then the other. And this function can take in two functions as arguments. So let's call this func1 and then func2. Do one and then the other. And so here I can have a set timeout, and I'm going to say do one, then the other. And I want to pass in my two functions. Right? And so in here we're going to call func1 and we're going to call func2. Right? So this is basically just a wrapper function. It just wraps, takes in two functions and runs those functions individually. Right? And then if I were to just execute this directly, do one and then the other, func1 and then func2, that's not very helpful because it's just going to run func1 and then func2, and then return the result of undefined, so we would get undefined here, and then some number, right? So if I did do one and then the other, right? So this gets a little tricky. So if we had hello, or say hello, and then say goodbye. Right? These are my two functions. This function is going to call both of them right away, but it's not going to delay because this is a function call. It's immediate. Right? So if I run this, right, we've got an error, invalid callback, because this just returns undefined. Right? That would be the same if we said undefined. Invalid callback. Right? So how can we get away with this? What do we want to do? Let's define a different style of say goodbye. And this is going to take in a callback. So this is something you do after you say goodbye. Or we already have say goodbye. Let's just call this do first. Right. So this is the function. We do this first, and that function might be console.log. This might say hello friend, and then we have this callback that should execute. Right? Callback. Alright, now we still have this problem. We've sort of eliminated, instead of taking two functions in as arguments, we just have this one, and this one calls at the end, and do first, the body of that first function is just here in the body of do first, and then we call the second function. But the same problem exists. This is still returning undefined right here. So even if we pass in do first here, that's not any good because it's going to try to call this function after the time goes by, and it's not going to pass in the right arguments. Right? So what we want to do is have this function return another function. Right? So instead of returning undefined here, we're going to have this return an anonymous function. Okay, so notice we're just using the return keyword and then defining a function. We could also, call this function a variable. We could call this f, and then return f. That would be the same thing. So this might be a little bit cleaner to look at. So we're going to define a function, right? And so we want, after the time that expires, we want it to say hello. Hello friend, but then we want it to do something else after, and we don't know what that other thing is. Okay, so do first. So this is going to return a function that says hello and then calls back to something else, and we don't know what that is yet. So here I can say do first, and this is a function call. And what I'll pass in is say goodbye. Alright, so now this is an expression. It's a function call. Do first takes in a function, say goodbye. Right? It creates a function. Inside of that function, this is mimicking the say hello, and then whatever it takes in, then it's going to call. Right? So since we're passing in say goodbye, it means after it says hello friend, it's going to say goodbye. Right? But we could pass in something else here, like we have print 2. So we'll do that next. So if we run this, hello friend, and then goodbye. Right? Let's add a console.log. Add a little divider in here. All right, so, oh yeah, so this is an example of just what I was talking about. It gets a little bit confusing when you start working in asynchronous JavaScript because I added this divider to separate the output of these two set timeouts. However, they're on a delay, so my divider printed out first, then these printed out, and then my other two, right? So I would actually need to put the delay somewhere in the say goodbye or this divider somewhere in the say goodbye function. So anyway, it gets a little hairy here. So this function is returning a function, and then timeout is going to call that function after this amount of time expires. Okay, so this is a callback, and it does get a little bit complicated, so you need to play around with this on your own, try different things. Let's try a set timeout, and we're gonna print 2 instead. Okay, so we have this print 2 function up here. It just prints out 2. It says print 2. So we're doing the exact same thing. So do first is going to say hello friend, and then say goodbye right afterwards. But then we call set timeout a second time with do first, and now we're using a different callback. So after do first runs hello friend, then it's going to use the callback. So we're passing in different functionality to be executed later. Okay, and so that's a callback. It's a callback to what was provided as an argument, right? So we wrapped that in a function. This is just a function definition, right? So when you have a function definition, it's not actually executed, but then we pass that function back, right? It's returned. So that function is effectively, so this is an expression, and it evaluates to a function, right? And then that function will get called, right? So this is sort of some sneaky JavaScript style stuff here, and it gets used all the time in JavaScript. It's a very, very powerful tool, so you're going to want to play around with this a little bit. So let's just take a look and see what print 2 does. All right, hello friend and print 2. All right, so yeah, we need to make this 2 seconds and this 3 seconds. Okay, that's because these are printing at 1 second, right? And there's a delay in here, so this maybe needs to be 3 seconds, and then this will be 4 seconds. So this is sort of some of the issues that come up when you're doing asynchronous JavaScript. You have to think in terms of when these things will fire, because it's not synchronous. I can't just put code one line after another here. It's not going to behave that way. Okay, so there's our first example, and then there's hello, goodbye, and then hello friend, print 2. All right, so that's a callback. So along the lines of asynchronous JavaScript and functions as arguments primarily, we've been talking about iterations, and I'm actually gonna, let's pop this over into another file with this asynchronous code. It gets a little messy, so alright, so we're gonna make a new file real quick, and this is gonna be this will be iterating over items with callbacks. With functions. All right, iterating with functions. And we'll paste this in here. So array iteration. So this concept of passing in functions as arguments is very, very powerful, and they use it in JavaScript. There's some built-in functionality around it. So let's imagine we make a function called do for each. Okay, and this takes in an array So we've got an array as the first argument. And then for each one of the items, we have a function called doThis. Alright? So that's the idea. This function takes in an array, and then for each one of these items, these individual items, it's going to do something, and we don't know what that is. Right? But whoever calls this function is going to pass in another function to do for each one of these items. Okay, so this is the power of passing in functions as arguments to other functions. Right? So what we can do here to iterate through the items of an array, we can use the for-of loop, right, and pass in one of these items. Right? So for item, let item of array, and then we can call doThis item. So then this for loop is for each one of these items. We're going to do this one thing and pass in that individual item. Okay, so the way this would work is I can say, let's have a function to simple display, and this takes a value, console.log, and just prints it out. And then we're going to have a different function that is a heading display. It also takes a value, and it's a little bit fancier, so it does something like this, console.log, and it prints out a little nice heading there, and then console.log, and then it prints the value in between. And maybe it even says value. Real fancy stuff here, right? So you have two different types of display functions. One's a simple version and one's a heading, a fancy display. Right? We might call that fancy. Right? Simple display and fancy display. So what I need is an array of items. Right? So I can have my array. I can define the array in the function call if I want. So I can say do for each, and I have an array of items. Right? I could say apples, bananas, cranberries. Right? There is my array. I might make this up here, fruits. Okay, so there's my array. Got it stored in a variable. And I pass in the array fruits. So for each one of these, I want to do something, right? Do this. What is that function? Well, the first time I call this, I'm going to do simple display. All right? So do for each takes an array and then a function. So for each item of the array, right? Remember the O is for ordered things. Arrays have an order. They start at 0 and go forward, right? So item is going to be each one of the items in the array at some point, and then we call the function do this while passing in that item. So for each one of the items in the array, we pass that in. Well, the function we're using is simple display. So the item then is this value, and then we just log it out. Okay, so this is going to be node and iterating with functions. Let's see, fruits. Left the S off. All right, and we see for each one of the items it printed it out. But I can change this up. I can change this to a fancy display. And we've got the fancier display. Or I can pass in an inline function. So this is an inline anonymous function. I'm just defining it as the argument. And so this function takes in a value, right? The item of the array, so I have to put that in here. This is the item. We'll make this string interpolation and do this. So this is a third way. So each one of these, it's a way to iterate over an array of things and do something with that item. Right? And the only thing that's different is we just pass in a different function to do. This function just does something with that particular item. Right? Now, as it turns out, there's a built-in way to do this in JavaScript. Do for each. You can actually, it's attached to the array object itself. So I can say fruits dot for each, and then I can pass in a function. So I can just pass in fancy print. Fancy display, sorry. Okay, so fruits dot for each is just like our do for each function. So we run this, and we see for each one of the items in the array, it executes that. So dot for each is on any array. So it's a very useful method that's attached to the arrays. For each, and you can pass in. I could pass in an anonymous function as well, and I could say that I hate these things. Right, so there's the I loves, and then there's the I hates. Right, but for each item, right, that's what this is saying, for each item. Another thing you can do with this is array filtration. Okay, so this is the last thing we're going to talk about in this episode. Array filtration. Let's say I have an array of items. Let's see, dates and I don't know, eggplant. There we go. I guess that's not a fruit. Maybe it is. We'll skip E. E's hard. We'll go figs. All right, apples, bananas, cranberries, dates, and figs. All right, and I want to filter out the items. We'll add grapes and grapefruit. Okay, if I want to filter out the items that start with G, for example, right? Array filtration is something that I'm going to want to work with, right? So I have this big list of data. Think if you had a user database filled with different users, and you want to select certain users that have certain traits. For example, the trait might be that they bought something in the last week, and you want to send them a coupon or something like that. So you have to filter through your gigantic list of users, right, for some condition, right? So how can we do that? We can call. I need to make a function called filter array. I'm going to pass in the array, and then I'm going to pass in a test function. Okay, so this is a function. We can even call it test function. And this function is going to take in each of the individual items in the array, and the output array from filter array is only going to contain the items that pass the test. So this test function is going to perform something on each of the items in the array, and it's either going to return true or false. If it's true, then that item gets passed into the new array. Okay, so I've got some new array. A new array, and this is empty. Right? So I want to iterate over all of these items. So I can use my for item of array, right? So that's for let item of array. Right? And then for each one of these items, I'm going to say if the test function. I call the test function passing in the item. Right? So if this test function, and I call it passing in the item, if this returns true, then we're going to add our item to the new array. We're going to say new array dot push. That's how you add something to an array, and you push it to the very end. So this is like, this appends it to the array. So new array dot push, what are we pushing? That item, because it passed the test. So if passed test, right? So if you pass in the item, and if that's true, then we add the item to our new array. And then finally, once we iterate through all of the items in the array, the original array we passed in, now we can return the new array. All right, and I forgot my parentheses around the if. Okay, so it's the syntax is a little bit complicated, right? But once you understand what's happening, you just have an array and you toss in a function, and if the item in the array passes the test, then it's part of the new array that's returned. Okay, so let's look at this console.log. We're going to have the original array, and that's fruits. And we're going to say fruits that I like. This is going to be a filtered array. So filter array. And what do we pass in? Our original array, which is our fruits. Right? So fruits. And then what's our test function? Okay, we'll have a really simple test function. If it starts with a G, I don't like those things, right? So my test function takes in the item, right? In this case, it would be one of our individual fruits, and we'll say if item 0, so the first character of the item, if that is a G, we're going to return false, because we don't like those. Otherwise, we return true. Okay, so one quick thing here, semicolon. This is an if statement. And notice I don't have an else statement, but the way I said that is if the first character of the item is a G, return false, and then otherwise return true. Because this is equivalent. Right? This is equivalent to what I had before. The reason being is once you return out of the function, no other code's going to run. Okay, so functions are a little bit different with its if statements. As soon as you return from the function call, the execution of the function stops. So you will never get to this line, right? Because you returned a value from the function. So I don't need an else statement here because it's inside of a function. All right, that's just a little aside. All right, so this is the array of fruits I like. All right, maybe I'll call this good fruits. Let good fruits. Okay, so we're filtering our original array, and if the item starts with a G, we're removing it from our list. And so now let's console.log good fruits. Fruits here. So this is the original fruits array and then good fruits after we've filtered out the items that we don't like. Okay, so this has grapes and grapefruits, and then the good fruits, we see we've removed all of the items that start with a G. Okay, so this idea of passing in functions to other functions is very powerful, and this too has a JavaScript built-in implementation, Good Fruits 2. So this is, we start with our fruits array and we say dot filter, and we pass in our test function. Right? This is our test function. So we can define it separately. You know, we could have function test fruit, and then we can just pass it in like that, or we can define it inline. Right? So this syntax might be a little bit tricky for you to follow at first, but you'll see this all the time in JavaScript where you just have a function defined in the argument itself. Right? In the position where the argument, because this is a function call. Here's the first argument, and then this is the second argument, and then here's the ending parentheses of our function call. Right? And so we're doing the same thing here. It's just a little bit cleaner because we didn't pass in the function directly. And we don't have this first argument fruits because that's here, fruits.filter. So we don't need to pass it in because the filter method is already aware of it because the filter method is attached to that array. Alright, and let's let, and then we'll console.log. This is good fruits 2, good fruits 2. And we see both of them have removed the items that start with G. Okay, so flow control, functions are flow control, and functions allow you to have callbacks with asynchronous JavaScript. So if you have some delay or you don't know when something's going to finish, but you need something to run after that thing finishes, usually you want to define a function with a callback, right? Okay, and then you can also use functions as arguments for things like iterating, right? One of the most common ways to iterate over an array is to use the array dot for each, right? But then array dot filter is very common as well. All right, so here's an array dot filter, and then up here we had our array dot for each. Okay, so functions as arguments, very powerful.